Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Leaders on Purpose for this opportunity. I'm Sarah Schellberg. I'm the Chief Growth Officer of Arbor Energy and Resources. We're a carbon removal and storage company delivering carbon negative energy. And I'm really honored to be the moderator for this discussion today. Our panel today really includes leaders who are driving the access, the development, supplies, community advocacy when it comes to renewable energy around the world. Joining us today, we have Daniel Layton, who is the chairman of Insortia Metals. We have Rama Aman, who is the CEO of MMG Capital. We have Michael Lee, who is the CEO of Octopus Energy. And we are waiting for, I think, Marcelo, who might be joining us.
Unsure. I think traffic might be bad, so we'll get started with the conversation.
I think we're all familiar with what that looks like during Climate Week and UNGA. So I'm just going to introduce our session and then turn it over to our panelists for an introduction. So we all know that we must reduce emissions by 46% by 2030 in order to get to net zero by 2050. And we know that the upcoming COP28 really is going to provide us a roadmap when it comes to needing triple the renewable energy that we have today and really transform sectors. And the IPCC's call to action really around carbon removal. We're looking at about 6 gigatons of CO2 removal per year by 2050, really to counterbalance really the hard to abate sectors. And so the private sector plays a very important role in really driving the transition to renewables and low and negative carbon solutions. So we must really collaborate across all actors in order to achieve this. So our discussion today is really going to focus on 4 key topics. The first is really that important role of the private sector, adaptation, the carbon markets, as well as supply chains. And we really want to anchor this discussion on what needs to happen today, how that leads us through 2030, and how we can really get there faster through collaboration and do it in a very just and equitable way. So I'm really excited to delve into these topics. These are leaders, as I mentioned, who are really helping to drive the transition through some of the work that they're doing to really unlock access, the technology, as well as sourcing of the materials that are very much needed. So with that, why don't I turn it over to the panelists to give their introductions.
You want to start with?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Hi, yes, I'm Daniel Layton, chairman of Insortia Group. We began this group when we exited the hydrocarbon space in 2016 to found battery, renewable metals, energies, sustainable mining, chemical-free mining, and we've evolved all the way from resource to final end product with a minimal usage, minimal impact, and with a lot of attention to indigenous communities and the areas that we operate.
Great.
Hi, I'm Rama Aman with MMG Capital. We focus on metals and mining sector, basically minerals that are needed for transition to green energy. For achieving our climate goals, we're not going to be all of a sudden dematerializing the world. We're going to need the minerals for all these electric vehicles and all these things. But how do you do this mining in a multi-stakeholder approach? And the projects that we invest in and we help on corporate finance and partnerships are projects that have a multi-stakeholder approach when they are doing their mining projects in the world. And our projects range from like copper in Namibia to boron in Serbia to lithium in Argentina. So all these minerals that are needed for this transition to green energy.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Michael Lee with Octopus Energy. Octopus is a modern energy company, and I think we have the opportunity of a lifetime to have consumers and individuals be the epicenter of the energy transition. We are going to 300, 400, 500% increase the amount of electricity that people consume as we move from molecule-based consumption to electron-based consumption. Octopus is an energy supplier that, yes, we own and operate wind and solar panels, but what we really want to do is consumerize the opportunity for customers to really re-envision how they interact with the energy ecosystem. You know, electricity is invisible, and so they need a product and an entity that they can trust. The utility historically has been that. We are a modern version of that utility. We help consumers really become proactive participants in electrifying their consumption and associating that, whether that's a hot water heater or a heat pump or an EV or a battery, every time they buy one of those things, reduce their energy costs. And they're reducing their energy costs because they're dynamically managing how and when those assets interact with the grid. And at Octopus, that's our specialty, is to take these millions of assets, operate them with what the grid needs, but also pass value significantly back to the customer.
Very much democratizing access. Sorry about that. All right, so with that, why don't we dive into the first topic, which is focused on really the importance of the role that the private sector is playing in both decarbonization as well as financing. We're certainly seeing some significant tailwinds from the public sector, which includes the historic Inflation Reduction Act here in the US, as well as Repower EU. And this is really driving a lot of momentum when it comes to decarbonization and the access to renewable energy. So with that, maybe I'll start with you, Michael. So how do we really maintain this momentum? You talked about it some in your introduction, and really continue to drive that demand. What are you seeing as some of those incentives and mechanisms that can really continue to help spur some of that demand and reduce emissions?
Again, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. People are already spending about $50 billion a year in the US on the electrification of everything, on EVs, on batteries, on solar, on new hot water heaters that are dynamically controllable. And so we see, in the DOE recently published a liftoff report about 2 weeks ago, where they see by 2030, this is going to be a $500 billion a year market opportunity. So the way that we're going to get there is not by talking about DERs and heat pumps and all these other fun buzzwords that we in the industry love to talk about. How we're going to get there is just talk about cost savings. In the world of $100 a barrel oil, I live in Houston. I get to go around and say, if you're paying more than $10 to fill up your tank, you're paying too much. Because that's how much it costs me to smart charge your EV with overnight wind. So we're just going to sell cost savings and inflation reduction. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act is great because it helps re-onshore supply chains and gets even more assets into the hands of customers faster. But the macro trend is that this stuff just saves customers money, and we're going to deploy a lot of it over the next few years.
Yeah, I was seeing a statistic that in 2021, actually, solar and wind energy in terms of cost was actually below coal. So yeah, absolutely focus on the things that really matter to consumers. So with that, maybe I'll turn to you, Rama, and the work that you're doing. So we know that these projects are extremely capital intensive. And I will say, having joined a startup recently, we know very much firsthand how difficult it is to raise the money and the capital that we need to stand up these projects. How do you think the private sector can really contribute to unlocking the necessary finance that's needed for climate action?
Right. So I think this is going to be one of the big challenges that we're going to face. The scope of financing that's going to be needed, just in general, is tremendous. It's like $2-3 trillion a year on top of that needs to be invested on top of the spend on infrastructure. So that already is happening. So this is a huge amount of money that needs to be spent because, as you know, like we're going to be producing 40 million electric vehicles a year by 2040. And today, all the world production of cars is like 67 million. So just that alone is going to hugely ramp up the need for huge amount of capex and a lot of resource development to achieve that. And these are, as you were saying, very capital-intensive projects. The projects are often, between 100 million to $1 billion, and then for bigger projects are $5 billion each. And the only way that I see there are three major ways that I see that huge amounts of capital can eventually be unlocked. All of them have huge obstacles that they're going to be meeting. But one is that on the private capital is provided by funds, and those funds have their investors as pension funds and sovereign funds and family offices. And the mindset of those final beneficiaries need to change towards climate action, and that needs to then trickle down in the kinds of mandate that they give and the urgency that they give to those funds to then deploy those capitals to the projects and what criteria they use. So that's one thing. The second thing are these international development banks, like World Bank, IFC, Inter-American Development Bank, EIB, and so on. And they need to. We talk a lot about blended financing. This is actually quite important. Going to be much more important to the extent that the non-project risk can be taken up by these multilaterals. So in terms of everything from foreign exchange to regulatory risk, political risk, all those kinds of insurance, if they can start covering a lot of that non-project risks, then these specialist capitals that understand the project but are very worried about all these other macro or regional or country risk can then manage and then bring in capital to it. And then the third is for government stability. A lot of these mineral projects with high capex are in regions that are unstable. And I know of projects in some countries in Africa, I can talk to you about it later, that require like 400 literally private soldiers to protect the mine, which is a ridiculous amount of expenses and so on. So to the extent that the governments can create stable legal framework, security, stability, and so on, then capital can start coming in, because these projects are 20, 30, 40 years long, and the capex is all upfront. So you're spending a lot of money, and if you are scared that, I'm going to spend all this money, and then 2 years later there's going to be political disruption or nationalization or whatever, I'm going to lose it, you're going to be much more hesitant to come in. And then the final thing I want to say about this is that for that to happen, we go back to this multi-stakeholder approach of the mining companies to begin with. Because until mining companies have that kind of an approach where their projects are being very focused on how they're going to develop civil society and take care of the environment and so on, they're not going to have that community support. They're not going to have that government support and so on. That then loops back. So I think it's kind of blended. There's not a simple solution, but I think we can get there. I'm very optimistic.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I heard you say first is getting the alignment with, on the private side with funding, with your LPs and the fund itself around climate, de-risking through the multilateral banks as well as governments. Hugely important. I know, Daniel, we had a chance to really briefly talk about this, and I think you, in your experience building the company, if anything you wanted to share just in terms of, financing in your experience.
Well, I can, and I've been talking about this for years. We funded most of our stuff ourselves. Yeah. And I think most people in this industry have it wrong. Now I'm not talking about the consumer stuff, the electric stuff, that's great, but that's a separate thing. I'm talking about large scale, actual industrial build-outs in foreign countries where you have to get the governments engaged, which they're not. That's the first problem. You came out with a really bad start off to this when you had the first thing was Namaska blew $1.9 billion on a technology that most people in the industry realized wasn't going to work. Our scientists said it wasn't going to work. They worked with that technology at Dow 20 years ago. But you have so many people that are globbing on to the green, the sustainability, the climate control, and they're technologies that don't work. They're people that are using the name to get money, even though they have no chance of ever succeeding. And so the investor base, especially the private equity in that, until recently, and I've seen a change, they're very confused about what's real, what's not going to work. This is a new industry. They're not qualified to make a decision, which is why we said, look, if we're going to do this, we're just going to have to fund it ourselves. We're going to have to fund it and show everybody that it works, which we did. And now I think we'll deploy probably in the next 24 months somewhere close to 1.2, 1.5 billion. And we're not having issues with institutional money. We're having a problem with institutional terms, which you always do, but this gets down to the next question of, who pays for the energy transition? Yeah. And at this point, it's going to have to be the consumers. A great example is the car companies. The OEMs did all their pricing models at $9,000 a ton for lithium. Lithium hit 70, it's sitting around 30, but I can tell you contracts are being done around 25. So they're still triple almost what they did their original projections on. So they're trying to beat us down on price. Meanwhile, we've got the capital providers wanting to get risk capital premiums on it. And so somebody's got to pay for this, and if you keep at the pace it's going to, what's going to happen is the projects just aren't going to get developed. 2027 is going to be a real tipping ground for this. It's when the raw materials really start to run out. You've got all the OEMs now that are already geared up to EV production. You had Sunak yesterday come out and say may push the UK's petrol ban to 5 years. So, it's not looking really good right now. And by the way, everybody likes to talk about EVs, and this falls into Michael, and I'm sure he can speak better on than I can, the importance of large-scale battery grid storage. That's going to be a very important thing in the electric markets. It's going to be a very important thing. Well, nobody's paying attention to those guys. Those guys are being starved for raw materials. Everybody's working on the EVs. The shortages, and we own an EV company as well. So, we deal with this at that level. It's a problem.
It is a problem, and we'll dig into supply chains as well, I think, in this conversation. So let's move on to the other topic, which is really about carbon market development. And we've seen, certainly as we think about the compliance market, it's hit about $1 trillion globally. We're starting to see the emergence of the voluntary carbon markets as well. And it's quite nascent. And we've certainly seen kind of at the outset some challenges. But we've got some organizations like the ICVC, which is the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, really starting to develop an assessment framework so we can get to better transparency and determination around quality. So with that, I think, this is going to, there's a bit of controversy and, is this greenwashing? And I would say, if you think about the science-based targets initiatives, there's about 6,000 companies now that have had, their targets approved. And, part of that allows for companies, right, if you think about some of the unabated emissions, about less than 10% is for carbon removal credits. So with that, maybe I can turn to Michael, Daniel, and Rama, to the extent that you have any comments around that, of just what are some of the ways that you think the private sector can really engage, in the carbon markets for emissions reductions? Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. So we're massively behind our goals. We need so much effort in every direction in order to hit our climate goals. The hard stuff, though, becomes easier when we do the easiest stuff first. So we first need to just build we need to 3 to 4x the amount of solar that's on the grid and that wants to be interconnected into the grid. We actually need to process it and get it built. We know that technology is ready to be built, and let's just get it built as fast as possible. Secondly, batteries. Batteries and demand response will help couple the intermittency of solar. Now there's harder things to decarbonize, like industrial activities. We should totally go figure those out. There's going to be electrical processes that we can use to go convert molecule-based processes to electrical stuff. And then there'll always be sustainable fuels and other alternatives. And then finally, the really hard stuff like carbon sequestration and carbon credits, we should totally do those too. Those will become easier as we get through the price curve. There are things that are farther along down the price curve that we need to accelerate into. And then those things that are not as far into the price curve, we need to continue to invest in those so that way over time they become more and more affordable. But there's no one silver bullet that if we just did one thing, then we can just continue to live our current lives exactly how they are today. We need to change the entire way that the system works. including all the assets that are on the grid. And that technology is there, and it's actually inflation reducing. That's why the Inflation Reduction Act actually is not too much of a misnomer over time. But this other stuff that's really hard, like carbon credits, carbon sequestration, we need to continue to invest in it so that way, once we've done the easier stuff, which is actually not that easy, but once we get through that, that harder stuff becomes not so hard in the future.
Yep. Rama, anything you want to add to that?
I think, does this work? There are a couple of things about these carbon credits that, it is a controversial topic. There are two angles to it that are interesting. One is that the carbon emitting companies are not probably correctly doing their accounting. They're not really looking at the true cost of their production and their profitability in the end. Because like oil and gas companies are not probably taking into account all the pollution and so on as part of their own costs. I know it's a big macro topic, but to the extent that if carbon credits becomes a policy and obliges these companies to really pay for it, then it brings a bit more parity in terms of this cost issue. And the second thing is that it does. I've seen it actually. Like we have a graphite project in Sri Lanka, and to make it green, to generate green credits, we're developing forestry projects in Pakistan and Africa. So it does help in terms of encouraging credits. But yeah, I understand the controversy around it as well. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think this is a nascent, emerging, industry, and I think over time, especially some of the work that's being done, we're going to see more in terms of, again, I think very much this call for integrity and quality, and again, transparency as well. So with that, I actually think it's a great segue as we get into the next topic, which is really about adaptation. Much of the focus really is around mitigation, but we know that there's an estimated almost 300 billion in potential losses by 2030 if we don't do anything about it. So we also know that really the most vulnerable communities, the least developed countries, have contributed the least but are impacted the most. I actually had the opportunity this week to meet the Yawanawa chief and his wife, the indigenous people of the Amazon. And what they told us was that they desperately need help when it comes to adaptation measures, particularly around access to renewable energy and electrification, particularly for the boats that they use. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really kind of level set here. And I think the work that you all do around the world to better really understand what this challenge looks like. If you can give us a sense of what are you seeing? What are some of the adaptation measures? How do you think that we can really kind of collaborate and think about ways for us to address the issues?
I think adaptation is hard, but it's going to be unfortunately, it's something we're going to have to do. The world is changing, right? At the very least, insurers are pulling out of Florida. I live in Houston.
And California.
Yeah, I live in Houston, and home insurance rates are practically doubling. Like, these are rational companies that are just looking at the statistics, and they're saying, what's the risk that they're taking on? And so adaptation is a piece of, I guess, self-insurance for people financially. I think for biodiversity, it's going to be probably the hardest question to answer, because there's a lot of species that live in very particular places that frankly can't turn on the air conditioning and adapt. But it's been, as someone who's lived in Texas, it's for the past 3 months, it's been brutal. It's been over 100 degrees for about 3.5 months straight. And while that has been the coolest, or that's been the hottest summer yet, it's probably the coolest one for the foreseeable future. So the challenges that we need to go figure out to adapt to a volatile and changing climate are hard to predict. There's going to be elements of resiliency from a electricity standpoint. That's why I personally get very excited about the distributed nature of our future energy system. We'll have a lot of small batteries, a lot of small solar. We'll have individuals participating in that ecosystem, but at the same time, the smaller the assets, the more resilient and adaptable the communities will be to changing climates. If you have single points of failure, like large coal power plants, as soon as you have a drought and you can't run those large assets, it's harder to be resilient and adaptable in that changing environment. So I think the more that we get distributed, the more that we have decentralization, technology is going to have to play a big piece in orchestrating all of that. And I think those are problems that are solvable. I worry about biodiversity. I worry about habitats. I worry about indigenous groups. There is going to be a lot of challenges that don't have easy answers that we're going to have to go figure out.
Yeah, I don't know, Daniel, Rama, anything to add? Rama, anything you want to add just in?
I guess my only big comment is that we discussed this earlier, that for the sector that I'm particularly involved with is, again, the mineral space. And the role that the companies can play, a lot of these projects are in remote areas and touch on people that don't have a lot of resiliency for adaptation, and they don't have a lot of resources to begin with. And I think these mining companies that are operating in these areas can do a lot in terms of their social responsibility and environment to help those communities. So it's one thing to, for example, build a rail from the mine to the port, and that's it. It's another thing to, create transportation for local communities and broaden it further, or provide other aspects to improve their social living standards, or help find solutions that work for them, and so on. I think all of these things do cost, and in the short term, the cost of these projects rise. But what I firmly believe is that these mining companies, when they do incur these costs, although in the short term, the cost structure does get more difficult, but in the long term, they'll have the community support, and their projects will be more sustainable. So on this topic, I think this was the comment I wanted to make.
I'll add that is just a given in our business, whether it's building a hospital or it's building water resources or things for the communities. I mean, those are small parts of doing business. Companies should do that just out of their general responsibility. And aside from that, I tell people, in this transition in the green, what people have to understand is a lot of corporate entities won't do good just to do good. There has to be a benefit out of it to the companies. And that's just the reality. And that's also how you get things funded, by the way. People want to make money off money. And sometimes when we talk about these topics, we forget about the economics of this. And we forget about the fact that if people make profit, people will do better if they're forced to do better. I would like to think we would do the things we do in indigenous communities regardless, but the driver behind it is it makes our life easier. We're able to do things, to gain access to things by taking care of things better, and it creates an economic and a corporate industrial ecosystem where everybody helps each other and everybody feeds off each other. So that's a given. If you do bad things, then you're just not going to be around long.
You risk the reputational kind of risk, and this is really about empowerment across all stakeholders.
And it's very easy in these kind of environments and people that are extremely environmentally and extremely green-minded to forget that at the core of this, there's a profit center and there's an economics, and it's about responsibility.
Right. Make that work for all communities. We're getting into the last topic here, which is around supply chains, which I know you're both very, very involved in. And so, as we think about really securing the transparency, especially as we move towards this transition, there's a lot of risks that are involved. The materials, you've already referenced this, that are really needed, right? Whether it's a shortage, access to some of these, critical minerals, whether it's battery storage, overall electrification. Oftentimes these materials are traveling really vast distances using fossil fuels. Again, kind of the risks around kind of the mining of some of these rare minerals and metals that are exposing, kind of environmental and potential worker safety rights issues. Maybe we can just start with either of you, just to talk really about understanding what are those key supply chain concerns. And as you think about it, what are your key stakeholders most concerned with?
I can talk about this because we actually, I think the OEMs, the industrial companies are, again, driven by their shareholders and their ultimate beneficiaries. The mindset is changing towards having green supply chains, and they more and more, all these discussions around scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and scope 4, and companies wanting to abide by that is going to trickle down all the way to mining. So we do see that, and I think this is eventually going to more and more change this whole mineral sector. But what's really exciting also is that there are a lot of new technologies that are developing that are making this easier. We have a boron project in Serbia that boron is used for transition to green energy. You need 6 tons of boron for each offshore turbine. It's used in solar panels and so on. But there's now a lot of studies done on what it can do with hydrogen. And we're exploring this opportunity of, in northern Scotland, they have a lot of wind turbines running all the time at full speed, and they're actually dumping a lot of electricity because it's just oversupply of the electricity that they're not using. And so the discussion we're having is how do you get that electricity generated, and then how do you use that electricity? And so there is a hydrogen project in Scotland, but the problem is transporting it. To transport hydrogen to the market is going to cost $1 billion or more of pipelines and so on, which is very expensive, and it again impacts the economics. But when you mix boron with hydrogen, and there's a whole technology, I can share the articles later, you can make it into an inert product. You can transport it by train, very, very, very safe because it's inert. And then at the location, you can again split it. The hydrogen can go to its user, and the boron can also be used again by the OEM that's in, let's say, Germany. So there are these evolving technologies so therefore, that company that's using the boron can also say that they are participating in this kind of a green supply chain because they're contributing to green energy of hydrogen. So there are these emerging technologies I just wanted to share as an example.
No, that was actually going to be one of my questions. I'm glad you mentioned that, because technology very much is going to be the key enabler here. Daniel, just would love your comments, given the work that you do.
Well, I mean, we're a mining company, but we're also a technology company. I mean, that's at the core of what enables us to do this in an environmentally friendly way. But the reality is, it's not going to happen in the time frame we think it's going to. It's going to be a train wreck. It's just how many people die in the process. There is no way to avoid it. There's not going to be enough materials. It's just not going to happen. People aren't moving fast enough. One of the problems is because you have a lot of these regulations that people are trying to comply with, IRMA, all the different scopes and everything else. But there's an old saying, and the energy transition basically is a startup. And there's an old saying, perfection is the death of all startups. You have to get it going. And it's not going right now. There has been one new lithium project online in 5 years. One. The rest are just sitting there doing nothing. And this is the problem. Everybody's just doing nothing but talking.
Yeah. How do we move to action? How do we start to move what you're talking about to action?
Well, one is governmental. I mean, Chile, for one, holds the key to actually being able to put a dent. We've maintained a staff of 8 to 12 people there for 7 years. I met with President Boric in Paris, and we had some wonderful conversations. but the politics of the country are keeping it from moving forward. It's one of the few countries that actually could make a difference. You see the governments, in particular the US government, funding the wrong projects. They're funding spodumene projects, which, by the way, when the environmentalists find out how you process spodumene, good luck with that. That's why it's all processed in China. They're funding more gigafactories that don't have enough raw materials to put in them. That makes sense. Let's put another couple billion into that. The U.S. is turning out to be a good resource. We've found a new property resource this week that had over 600 ppms of lithium concentrate, which is higher than Argentina, than what we got in our mines in Argentina. So, but again, you've got to get it developed. You've got to get capital into it. You've got to somehow get this off center. I mean, we can make a difference. We are going to make a difference. Our company's going to make a dent, but we can't change the course of it. And once it stalls, then you've got a real problem, because where do you go?
Yeah, inertia. Michael, anything you want to add just from a supply chain perspective in your experience?
I'm a believer in markets. I think that as we have more consumer adoption in the products, there'll be a bright signal to kind of go follow. I think that signal will be followed by two ways. Just more emphasis to unlock the things that the mining team needs to get more products, but also recycling. I know Redwood Materials has got a kind of conditional grant from the DOE to kind of do some recycling. I think you're gonna have a lot of innovation from a lot of entrepreneurs tackling problems, right? There's problems, great. Let's unlock entrepreneurs to go solve those problems. Let's not keep talking about how there's problems. So
it's true, but Michael, you got to remember something. Remember the numbers, okay? We produce 600,000, give or take, tons of battery-grade lithium right now. The need by 27 is north of 3 million. Okay, you couldn't get there with all the money in the world right now. All the money in the world wouldn't do it. So you got to reset it somehow.
So these are all infrastructure problems. Infrastructure problems are long lead, capital intensive, and the more certainty we can give markets to kind of go invest in it, that's great. The challenge with that is what you just mentioned earlier, is sometimes we give the wrong incentives to the wrong things, so we have to just figure out which one we're going to be comfortable with. Are we okay with incentivizing the wrong thing every once in a while to get other things potentially right? Or, like you said, maybe we want perfect to kind of be the focal point, which will enable us kind of in our current spot, which is a failure to launch in some of these massive investments.
You just got to get it going, even if it's not perfect. You can worry about perfect and tweaking it as you go down the road. Right now, we just have to get more people engaged, and we have to get more private equity in. We have to get more people.
Yeah. And I think on that note of just getting more people engaged, I'd love to start to close on how are you catalyzing change? What is the advice that you have really for the future generations and the future leaders of our world? Maybe Michael, I'll start with you.
Look, there's only one pathway forward. You can just go down the street and you can see an entire generation of people that will not give this up. They want to be part of this. Mm-hmm. And so as we look forward to what capitalism looks like and businesses look like 5, 10, 20 years from now, you either have an energy strategy or you don't exist as a company, right? We all will be part of the energy transition, even if it's not the core of the company's focus right now. Because the opportunity, at the very least, the opportunity is so big that why would a company not want to be part of that? And at the very least, if they're not part of it and they don't, in this world today, everyone's a tech company. Why? Because in order to stay alive, you have to invest in tech. In the world of the future, every company is going to have an energy strategy in order to stay alive. So we are going to have a lot of skills at a lot of different companies. But what we're definitely also going to have is a workforce that's passionate. Our organization, we have about 5,000 employees globally. We've only been around for about 7 years. And we've had about 500 job openings over the past year. And we've had over 1,000 applicants for every single job that we've had open.
Wow.
So it's not hard to find great people who have great skills and are passionate about solving big problems. You just have to make sure that the leadership is authentic about actually empowering and solving those problems. And once employees see that, then they want to be part of that organization.
That is a message of hope, for sure. Maybe Rama, we'll go to you.
You want to go first, then I give hope. So, I mean, I'm also on the hope side. I think, as we discussed, the problems are quite complex and very, very multifaceted. I mean, I have a personal conviction that I'm in private equity and investment banking world, and I have been for the past 30 years and understand pretty much how these investments are made, how they're evaluated, and so on. I think we are moving, in order to tackle a lot of these problems, we have to also think about shifting from pure focus on return, risk and return, to other KPIs that matter. And the investors have to kind of see those as important KPIs and consider those way making investment and not just be economic driven. I know I'm saying a lot of hopeful things, but I think I think the one sector that's evolving within our financial space is this impact investing. And it is a real thing. I know some people are looking at it skeptically and saying, "Oh, this is not real" or whatever. But I do see some of the impact investing organizations that are doing a lot of good, and that's when the investment also considers the impact, the social impact, the local impact, and projects that can do. And then finally, how do you blend it with philanthropy, with these multilateral banks and governments? So you really need the collaboration of governments, philanthropies, and investors to really move this, because I don't think you can necessarily solve everything by risk and return in a short-term basis.
Yes, absolutely. Daniel.
I agree with that completely. We've met with a lot of philanthropic organizations that want to take over some of the investment, and you're starting to see a new wave of philanthropic organizations, funds that are quasi-private equity, but philanthropic. And they want a return. They don't require a private equity return, but they want it to be into the communities, into sustainable things. And that is a real positive, because that is a way that you could see lots of dollars flow into these type of projects.
Yeah.
I think that's important. I agree. Consumer need, desire, demand, that helps all of us. That helps us get more capital, helps us grow. Consumers picking things that are green, picking things that are sustainable, like his electric company, EV purchases. Those things help loosen up the financial community. If they see that this is the route that's going, they want to invest more money into it. So consumer demand is important. We still got a long way to go.
We do. Well, and I will just say that I think just seeing the younger generation, I am too hopeful. I had a chance to hear Amanda Gorman, who, if you're not familiar with her, she's the youngest inaugural poet in history. And she spoke this week, and she talked about how it's no longer about you telling the younger generation that you're going to change the world. You're telling them you're going to save the world. And that was just so, I think, profound for many of us in the room. And so for us, I think leading with a message of hope, even though it feels extremely dire, even though at times it feels very tough, but it is an opportunity, I think, really just to inspire. And I think that's where I have hope is as we look around, even our own organization, we see all the young people who are really kind of supercharged. They're excited to do this and energized, that I think is going to continue to carry us through on this mission. So with that, I would love to thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to our fantastic speakers for this discussion. Appreciate it.